reparations say, and why are they wrong?
Well, when the commission to study reparations and make proposals, the H.R. 40 came up in the Judiciary Committee, that might be a place to look at some of the opposition voices, the Republican congresspersons, the people who they had to testify in that Judiciary Committee hearing. And one of the points I seem to recall them making is that reparations is wrong because it involves paying money to people who were never enslaved themselves and taking from people who have never done anything to practice slavery. So to take from the American taxpayer in 2023 this kind of money to pay people who themselves were never enslaved is wrong. So it's kind of a temporal argument. It says that the only time reparations are owed is if the party that was harmed is still alive, and therefore you can directly pay this party who's still alive. And since the people who were enslaved are all deceased now, none of them are still alive, you're wrong to try and repay their descendants. It's just not right. Their descendants don't deserve anything. They were never enslaved. They've had the same opportunities as everybody else in the country, and the people who you would be taxing to pay those reparations, they have done nothing wrong. They've had nothing to do with slavery. So why should they be taxed for something they themselves never did?
But I think that explanation sometimes tend to ignore the fact that even though the people that are alive today that need the reparations, even though they are not the ones that were enslaved, they are victims of slavery itself. And even the people that are supposed maybe to contribute to the reparations themselves are beneficiaries over generations and generations. A similar explanation can be given for African people who lost their land during colonialism and are now trying to get land redistribution policies through government. How best can we convince this group of people that reparations can indeed be paid and are justified?
So if we look at polling, just since the change of the millennium, since around 2000, different polling, objective kinds of polls have been conducted, particularly of non-African Americans in the United States, non-Africans in the United States, white people particularly, the white majority. So back in early 2000, the number of whites who had any level of support for reparations, we're not talking about necessarily a $14 trillion price tag, but just the concept, was about 3% of white people. Today, polls, some of the most recent polls show support over 30%. So there has been a tenfold, kind of increase amongst whites just over the last 20 years. And the question becomes what kind of messaging, what are they seeing differently now than then that has caused this level of support to begin to emerge? And of course, 30% is not to be sneered at. During the height of the Civil Rights era in the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, the white majority, according to the polls then, did not support those changes. They really didn't. It was closer to around 30, about 30% were supportive. In the Deep South, whites were completely against. In other parts of the country, it was kind of mixed, 50-50 maybe, some of them. And so there was no overwhelming support like that for civil rights changes, just at that level. So to the change we've seen, if polls can be believed to some extent, is a huge thing. And I think it perhaps goes to a number of things. I think that the question of wealth itself, I think the country realizes that the kind of obscene, immoral, unjust level of control of wealth, where 1% of the population of the United States controls more than 50% of the wealth. And the wealth disparity of where the average white family, white household, the average wealth, and so I'm talking about how much they own of their home, how much they have in the bank, in savings accounts, how much their pension, of the ones who've been working, their pensions could cash out at. That average wealth is close to $1 million for the average white household, 900 and something thousand. For African Americans, the average amount of wealth is only about 130. So their level of wealth is 9 times greater than the average wealth of African Americans. I think people are seeing that level of inequality is just not sustainable. When the financial collapse of 2008, and of course some dug in their heels and said, it was all due to giving these home loans, mortgages to poor people, black people especially, that caused the collapse, because those loans weren't very good, and those mortgages should never have been given, and the government had to suffer. And then that lie was that was exposed as a lie when you look at all of the ways in the financial dealings within the system, and so the reality then that of the wealth inequality, I just think has begun to open many people's minds and hearts to a certain need for change. Also, the systemic violence that goes unabated from Trayvon Martin to Ferguson, Missouri, and the deaths there in New York, big cities, all across the country. The way black people could be killed by the police, or killed by vigilantes, or killed by whomever, and no justice, and the movements that sprung up so spontaneously and massively, crying no justice, no peace, and ultimately punctuated in the 9 minutes of video of the police on the neck of George Floyd, when he posed no threat, he posed no, and could have been allowed to live. That lynching, public lynching, I think it has produced a certain desire to see real change to the system. And it's still a struggle, and there's certainly a hardcore that don't see it that way, that will oppose reparations. But the fact that we have begun, and again, the numbers amongst African Americans are substantially in favor of reparations. 70% or more would like to see something done in this direction of reparative justice. I mean, you'll often hear when you talk to individual blacks, there's no amount of money that can pay, and that's all true. Money can't address all the harm that was done, but most recognize something ought to be done to close the wealth gap.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Professor Shabazz. Have a good day.
My pleasure.
Wonderful.